The first time they threw her food away, it happened so fast she didn't understand what was being taken. A plastic container opened. A puff of steam rose like a small prayer from home. And then hands, careless and certain, swooped in to lift her lunch toward the trash can as if removing a problem. A chorus of sounds poured over her. The dragged-out vowels of mockery, the clipped command of a hall monitor who meant well but too late, the metallic slap of the lid on the bin. Her name was on a label her mother had carefully stuck to the container, written in a neat hand that hoped the world would treat that name the way the family did. Gently, with pride and care. That day, her name sat in a heap with napkins and orange peels and things nobody wanted to claim as part of themselves. This is the story of what she decided to do with that moment. It is a story about the geography of the school cafeteria, a place where power runs along the seams of a plastic tray, where kindness can be as simple as trading a tater tot, and cruelty can be as swift as a hand tipping a container into the trash. It is about the way a child learns early what belongs and what is banished, and how that lesson burrows into grown-up decisions about where we eat, who we hire, what we serve, and who we believe deserves seconds. It begins under buzzing fluorescent lights and ends in boardrooms with contracts and policies and budgets. It begins with shame and ends with ownership. It is above all a story about the alchemy of resilience, the way one girl, told in a dozen ways that her food and, by extension, herself did not belong, refused that lesson so thoroughly that she built a place where belonging is the house rule. She was born in a city where the sun rolled across rooftops like a coin and settled, at the end of the day, into a bowl of mountains. The kitchen was the center of gravity in her family's small apartment. 4 burners, a small counter, the smell of onions browning at all hours, a window fan fighting an impossible fight against the heat, and the narrative of a whole neighborhood cooking at once. Her mother's hands taught her the difference between food and sustenance. Food fills a stomach. Sustenance fills a life. There were recipes with directions and recipes with stories. Your grandmother used to make this when the rain wouldn't stop, her mother said, pouring batter with the measured care of a chemist. Your grandfather swore this stew brought him luck, she said, scattering a pinch of spice over a simmering pot the color of evening. They had moved halfway around the world with the kind of luggage a customs officer cannot inspect. Language tucked into the lungs' memory, gesture folded into the body's habits, flavors pressed flat into the mind like flowers saved in the pages of a book. At home, the old country lived in the way they ate, the platter centered with injera like sun-striped fabric, the slow heat of berbere rising like a second voice in the room, the communal reach of hands toward the same place, because love and hunger are not solitary pursuits. Even on nights when money was thin and the promise of the next paycheck felt like a rumor, the kitchen insisted that abundance was possible. Pot of lentils can feed many, if it is made with purpose and discipline. The apartment's other rooms tried, in their own ways, to match the kitchen's warmth. Shared beds and shared books. Shoes left by the front door in a neat parade. Laughter that made the walls feel like accomplices. School came with paper-wrapped textbooks and pencil case battles, and teachers who pronounced her name with practice, and teachers who made a show of getting it right, as if correctness were a special favor. In the classroom, she learned the difference between memorization and understanding. In the cafeteria, she learned the difference between tolerance and acceptance. The racial climate of her childhood wore many masks. Some days it wore a smile and asked if she could say something in her language, as if the tongues carried inside her were party tricks. Some days it wore a frown and said her hair drew too much attention, as if the job of a child were to vanish. On the worst days, it wore the word that made the air colder by 10 degrees and left teachers scrambling to normalize what should be condemned. She noticed that some foods earned immediate respect. Pizza, hamburgers, pudding cups with foil lids that peeled back to a satisfying plop. Her food, the one that smelled of smoke and sun and the deep bottom notes of spices older than the country she now called home, did not. Adults hinted at fitting in, a phrase so heavy it bent her back when she tried to carry it. Fit in how? By cutting out parts of herself until the shape matched the container, by pretending not to hear when a classmate held their nose and said her lunch smelled like garbage. When she cried once in the bathroom, Her mother found her afterwards. Read the story without asking for the words, and chose action. The next morning, she taught her how to roll the injera tighter and tuck it beneath the stew, how to tape the lid down so sudden hands couldn't make it fly, how to breathe when breathing felt like the only thing she could control. After school, she drifted toward the kitchen not because she had chores, though she did, but because that was where her body understood how to be. She learned to dice vegetables even, to stir steadily, to listen for the particular sputter that meant onions had moved from raw to ready. The stove's glow became a language and she grew fluent. With it came a question that had been forming slowly. What if the cafeteria were more like this kitchen? What if the cafeteria could be a place where a kid's whole life came to the table instead of being checked at the door? There are incidents that blaze like fireworks and are remembered in detail, and there are incidents that feel small, like gravel in a shoe, but wear a blister that lasts. She had a handful of each. The first vivid memory has the smack of a lid, and the stutter of a laugh lodged in her ear. She sees the cafeteria in a frame of fluorescent light, the too shiny floor, the tables that fold into the wall like schoolboys straightening up for inspection. She remembers the air conditioning blowing unevenly, so one corner was always uncomfortably cold, and how that corner yoked together the kids who didn't like attention, the kid with the lisp, the kid who couldn't stop tapping his foot, the kid who wore the same sweater 3 days in a row, and her. Her mother had packed a lunch heavy enough to make the bag hurt a little, a roll of injera folded like a letter, a small thermos with red stew thick as a blessing, a handful of grapes nestled in a cloth napkin, because old habits refused to bend to disposable convenience. She took out the thermos carefully. She unrolled the injera with the concentration of a scientist. The smell lifted, and she smiled because she loved this before she remembered, in a stone drop of dread, where she was. A girl from her science class slid across the bench in a motion too practiced not to be planned. A boy clambered over the table like a conquering explorer, and by the time she reached for her food, the lid was lifted, the thermos tilted, the stew showing its red heart to a room eager to watch. "Gross," someone declared with the authority of a judge. "Trash," the boy said, grinning. The stew fell. A teacher rushed over late. The scolding landed on everyone and therefore on no one. The boy was loud and contrite. The girl said she didn't mean it like that. The staff came with paper towels and frowns and the efficient choreography of adults cleaning up, without addressing what spilled. She stood, caught in the odd daze that follows a small public humiliation, and stared at the smear of red creeping toward the table's edge. The janitor's mop, its gray head always a little too wet, arrived like a quiet conclusion. The bell rang. Life marched on as if a lesson had been taught. She went hungry the rest of the day. A few months later, a different kind of incident unfolded, not as spectacle, but as a slow-motion study of exclusion. The school announced International Food Day, a showcase of culinary diversity. She watched as kids brought in store-bought noodles labeled as exotic, dumplings in plastic trays sweating under lids, curry that had been made so timid it couldn't offend even the most delicate palate. She brought in dorowat and shiro, and injera stacked warm in a basket. Teachers applauded the effort. Parents took photos. "So authentic," someone exclaimed, as if the food's only available category was anthropological. A group of boys approached, loaded plates, and made gagging faces between bites, theatrically choking, performing disgust like vaudeville. The laughter landed this time not just on her, but on the entire table. The 4 kids next to her with dishes from their own homes, a little island of nervous pride in a room that wanted diversity, without the obligation to change its mind. A third memory features authority disguised as neutrality. At the start of 7th grade, the principal announced a rule: no strong-smelling foods in the cafeteria, citing allergies and distractions. The list of examples was an inventory of other people's kitchens: kimchi, fish stews, garlic-heavy dishes, fermented anything. A note went home asking for parental support. Her mother read it slowly, lips pressed to a line, then put the paper down and folded her hands on top of it. "Does it list pizza?" she asked. "Or the meat that sweats in the buns?" No, it did not. The rule dressed itself in the language of safety and fairness. and walked into the cafeteria like a bouncer, choosing who gets in. She switched to peanut butter sandwiches and baby carrots that tasted of chlorinated water, and she ate them without tasting them at all. Hunger comes in flavors other than empty. Then came the day they posted a chart on the cafeteria wall, listing names and outstanding lunch balances. The district had moved to prepay accounts. She didn't eat school lunch, but the chart found her like a bloodhound because shame has a way of sniffing out the most tender person in a room and asking her to feel everything. She watched another kid, small and careful, press his fingers over his own name, and then sit at a table without a tray. An aide placed an alternate meal in front of him, milk and a slice of cheese between two bare pieces of bread. He ate it with the concentration people use when they refuse to cry. She looked at that sandwich and recognized it immediately, a rule pretending to be a solution. She thought of how easily rules can be weaponized against kids who don't have a vote. That night she could not sleep. She stood in the kitchen in the dark and let the fridge's hum be her metronome. She took out a pot by habit and then put it back. She leaned on the counter and drew circles on the condensation left by a glass. Somewhere between one breath and the next, the circles turned into a plan. It wasn't detailed yet and it wasn't feasible yet, but it was hers. If a cafeteria could make hunger worse, then a cafeteria could make it better. If rules could wound quietly, then policies could heal loudly. She said the plan out loud even though no one was awake to hear it. I'm going to feed them all. The first resistance was against silence. She started talking in places where complaining is treated like a character flaw. She told her mother about the spilled stew and the boys performing disgust like theater. Her mother listened like someone who had crossed oceans to offer this exact skill to a child, to take in the words without defensiveness and return them as strength. We will not make you smaller to fit a small room, she said. We will find you a bigger room. The second resistance was against scarcity. College was not guaranteed. Money had the habit of disappearing into rent, medicine, bus passes, all the dull things that keep a life together, so the interesting things can happen on top. She earned scholarships with the same determination she stirred a pot to keep it from burning. She chose a major with a foot in two worlds, nutrition and business. She took electives that taught her how to measure impact, and others that taught her how to hold a room without pretending to be someone else. She worked in a campus dining hall, where the manager was a man who had stopped believing food could be anything other than logistics. She watched how he scheduled labor, and applied cost per plate, and ignored the eyes of the kids eating. She learned his math because she would need it. She learned his blind spots because she would correct them. Internships were worse and better. Worse because she saw up close how contracts get awarded. The old boys club in clean pressed shirts, bidding wars that had nothing to do with taste, nutrition targets hit on paper but missed in stomachs. Better, because she found allies in unlikely corners. A school board member who had grown up hungry and never forgot it. A cafeteria manager who had taught herself to cook decent rice in bulk, despite a steamer that was older than she was. A driver who knew which routes got meals to schools faster, and which potholes shook the lids off soup and turned lunchtime into triage. She took notes. She began to understand that if you want to change what is fed, you must learn who orders, who pays, who signs. Her first job out of college was in a cubicle that smelled faintly of toner and stale coffee. The company serviced hospital cafeterias and corporate lunchrooms, and she could feel, in the numbers, exactly where the money went. Toward cheapness dressed in salt and fat, toward deals made at volumes that erased the individual mouth from consideration. She lasted a year and left with a file of contacts and a contempt for people who can say, consumer, 50 times in a meeting and never say person. She wrote a business plan. It was a messy, dear thing, full of straight lines drawn through obstacles as if the obstacles were polite enough to move. She found a partner who shared not only her anger, but her stamina. Together, they mapped what a different cafeteria company would look like. Seasonal menus that tasted like today and not last week. Contracts that paid a living wage instead of shaving pennies off the payroll. Training modules that started with equity and worked outward to efficiency. Deliveries timed to protect freshness and dignity. They chose a name that said what they were doing out loud. They rented kitchen space in a former warehouse where pigeons watched their meetings like skeptical investors. They bought second-hand equipment, borrowed van time from a friend, learned the heartbreak of a walk-in fridge that failed at 2 a.m., and the triumph of a menu that made a fourth-grade class cheer. Resistance became granular. They pushed back against school policies that forbade spices under the argument that spice equals heat and heat equals complaint. They pushed back against principals who wanted a lot of beige on trays because beige calms frightened parents. They pushed back against vendors who tried to slip inferior produce into deliveries because kids can't tell. They pushed back against the idea that breakfast could be a sugary bar inhaled standing up in a hallway instead of a sit-down ritual that tells a kid, you are about to do something that matters. Fuel yourself. They trained staff to pronounce names correctly and to celebrate the day. A girl returned to school with her lunchbox opened like a treasure chest and peeled back an injera roll the way a magician reveals a scarf. They made mistakes. A chowder broke in the steamer and went to the kids looking like a failed science experiment. A tray sealer jammed during a heat wave, and a line piled up and spilled into the hallway. A menu featured a beautiful pilau that not a single kindergartner could pronounce, and most of them refused to touch. They apologized, learned, adjusted. They leaned into the argument that what is unfamiliar is not unsafe. They learned how to design tasting days that made curiosity contagious, how to use posters not as propaganda but as invitations, how to get the teacher with the stern face to take a first bite and let her approval ripple outward like a stone tossed into a pond. The legal resistance came dressed in state codes and procurement rules. They learned to write bids that sang and satisfied, that held poetry in the sections where poetry was allowed, and weaponized data where it was not. They learned how to meet caloric requirements without reducing lunch to a math problem, how to balance the quiet mathematics of hunger with the loud politics of school boards. When a district tried to impose the old alternate meal shame sandwiches, they came with a pilot plan and a stack of testimonials, and the principal from a school where the plan had been killed and replaced with grace. It took months and more meetings than any sane person would attend. The change slid through, quiet as a new habit, and the chart of unpaid balances came down without ceremony. The turning point did not feel like a victory parade. It felt at first like another meeting. The district was large, the kind of large that swallows good ideas and jostles good intentions in the machinery of how we've always done it. The room was set to skepticism. They sat across from a row of people in serious clothes who had been asked too many times to believe that the next vendor would solve the impossible problem of feeding 20,000 children well, for not enough money. She could feel, like an extra sense, the doubt falling off their shoulders in flakes. She led not with promises, but with a story. She told them about the day a boy tore open a bag of carrots and said, "They taste like water," and how they changed suppliers. Not because a carrot's destiny is to be delicious, but because a child's destiny is to learn what food tastes like when someone cared. She told them about the girl who brought her lunch, her own food, and sat at a table where it had once been thrown away, and how the table leaned in to watch her spread stew on bread like they were watching a ceremony. She told them about the teacher who had started taking photos of the lunch line every month because she wanted to measure if delight could be captured in pixels. Then she gave them numbers: waste down, participation up, complaints lower by a third, attendance better on test days, behavior referrals trending to sanity between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. She smiled only at the end. You have to earn a smile at a meeting like this. They played the old cards: cost, logistics, training, risk. She answered with the new deck she had built. Community partners to hold the line when the budget tried to erase words like fresh. A paid pipeline to train cafeteria staff into managers. A schedule that worked for human bodies, not just spreadsheets. A plan for when a truck broke down and oranges rolled. Across an intersection like tiny suns, the vote came weeks later in a school gym with wood too polished and microphones that made every speech sound like a sermon whether it deserved to be or not. A board member, a woman old enough to know the shape of her own regrets, raised her hand. One by one, others followed. A man in a too-tight tie whose son ate school lunch because pride tastes worse than hunger. A teacher who had come straight from detention hall with ink on her fingers. A parent with 2 jobs who looked like she might fall asleep standing up if this ran too long. The contract was awarded. The cafeteria chain that began as a whispered plan in a dark kitchen became the largest provider in a district that had trained itself to be suspicious of hope. On the first day of the new contract, she stood in a warehouse as the sun came up through the dust and turned everything the color of memory. The staff arrived, hairnets and jokes and coffee breath, and the palpable relief of doing a job that wasn't an apology for something else. Vans rolled out like a small army delivering a daily peace. She visited a school just as the bell rang for lunch and felt her throat tighten at a sight so simple it felt revolutionary. A 4th grader holding a tray like a gift, sitting down and taking a first bite without flinching. Success changed the pace, not the purpose. The company opened 2 more kitchens, not because growth was holy, but because the need was. They acquired a fleet of vehicles that did not break down in the middle of the summer heat. They hired a chef from a hotel who had grown bored of plating for people who wouldn't taste. Now he taught cafeteria staff to coax sweetness out of tomatoes and to warm bread to exactly the temperature at which a child's shoulders drop. They hired a logistics lead who could thread vans through the city in a snowstorm and still get breakfast into hands before the bell. They organized family table nights where parents were invited to eat the meals their children ate at school. Some arrived skeptical. It's just school lunch. They left full boxes for home in hand. Opinions changed not by argument but by bite. They set up advisory panels not for show but for correction. Students told them when the greens were too bitter, when the rice needed a different hand, when the pasta tasted like disappointment. They listened. They fixed it. They created halal and vegetarian lines without theatrics. They trained staff to answer questions about ingredients with respect. They put translations on signs because it should not be a test to find your plate. She turned down a handsome offer from a national conglomerate that wanted to buy them and file them under a portfolio called something like Community Solutions. She said no because she had watched too many good systems be wrecked by quarterly goals. She negotiated instead financing that allowed them to raise wages again and to offer health care that did not punish a worker for getting sick in the winter. She created an internal program to pay for culinary certifications, knowing that talent comes alive when it is invested in. She testified once before the city council against the reintroduction of alternate meals. She brought with her 1,000 folded notes written by kids, each on a sticky square, each with the same message in different letters. Don't shame us. She passed them to the committee one by one. The room went silent in the way rooms do when they have been confronted by something simpler than argument, a plea from a child not to be singled out in front of their friends for the sin of poverty. The policy failed on the floor. She went home and ate leftovers straight from the container, standing at the sink, more relieved than triumphant. The chain became known not for its efficiency, though it had that, but for its insistence on seeing lunch as a ritual of care, not a chore to be finished. A boy who used to linger at the end of the line started volunteering in the morning, and by the end of the year, had a job offer for the summer. A girl who had stopped eating at school because she didn't want anyone to comment on her food signed up to be on the tasting panel and delivered her verdicts with a dignity that made the room sit up straight. Teachers began to take their breaks in the cafeteria again, as if remembering that adults need to eat like humans to teach like humans. The company's vans with their modest logo became a familiar sight. In a storm, they carried breakfast to shelters. In summer, they parked at parks and handed sandwiches and fruit to anyone who asked because children do not stop needing to eat when school is out. On Thanksgiving, they opened the warehouse and set up tables and invited everyone who had ever worked a shift to bring their families. Grace was said in 3 languages. Laughter came in only 1. The cafeteria is the place where a child first learns how the world intends to feed them. It can teach them to stand in line and accept what they're given, or it can teach them that choices are their birthright. It can teach them that some foods belong and others, and by extension some people do not. Or it can teach them that a table is wide enough for the world. The girl whose lunch was thrown away grew into a woman who set out more chairs. There will be other incidents in other cafeterias, And there will be days when it feels like the old rules have simply put on new clothes. But there is also this: a chain of kitchens where the lights come on before dawn. Workers tie aprons and tie their hair back and wash their hands, and start the kind of work that matters so much it is often invisible. There are trays carrying not only food, but an argument made in apples and rice and stew. You belong here. There are contracts written to enforce care, budgets adjusted to purchase dignity, policies revised so that a child does not learn shame in a room designed to teach them community. If you are a principal, ask what your lunch line is teaching that your English class cannot undo. If you are a parent, ask what jokes you make in front of your children about food they've never tried and the people who cook it. If you are a student, notice who sits alone and why, and go sit there. If you are anyone who eats, and that is all of us, remember that the way we feed each other is the way we tell each other what we are worth. They threw her food away. She built a place where nothing is thrown away, not a cuisine, not a language, not a child. And day by day, tray by tray, bite by bite, she is turning a room designed for rules into a room designed for love.